So in the previous video, I talked a little bit about biological rhythms, one of them being circadian rhythms, the sleep-wake cycle, the arousal cycle, the alertness cycle, we might call it. Let's talk a little bit more about sleep. Now, sleep is an altered state of consciousness. It's not necessarily a period of mental and physical shutdown. It's not your body is and your mind are totally shut down or shut off or closed off. It turns out that sleep is this altered state of consciousness where you can actually sense things, you can hear things, and so on. So it also turns out that your brain is incredibly active as well, and there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of interesting things about sleep. Now, we study sleep in the laboratory using an electroencephalograph, an EEG. And this is what an EEG looks like. It's a series of electrodes that are connected to wires, and they are literally glued to your head. Um, you know, a technician, an EEG technician, will apply a glue-like substance that is conductive. It means it conducts electricity. Very little electricity, and this is electricity that is not like a shock or anything like that. These electrodes, these sensors, are placed all over your head in very specialized, very um, sort of rigid locations. There's an array of electrodes, and they're placed in particular locations relative to things like your nose and your eyes and so on and so forth. So this detects electrical activity in the area nearby that electrode. It's not a lot of activity. That's why there's so many of them. The sensitivity of these electrodes is not particularly astonishing, but as you can see from how close they are together on this guy's head, there's some overlap between what this electrode here is measuring versus this electrode and so on. It measures really only activity in the cortical area of the brain. That's the outer um, uh, layers of the brain. It doesn't near the skull. It can't measure activity in deeper structures. So when we talk about EEG function, we're talking about electrical activity, or we're talking about EEG activity, we're talking about activity that's in the cortical areas, the cortices of our brain. Now, when we study sleep, we also usually look at eye movement and some other things, but I don't have pictures of those. Now, typical EEG activity is you'll see something like this when you're awake, and we call those um, beta frequencies. When you're sort of resting, maybe even quiet and sort of just hanging out, you might get these alpha frequencies where you can see sort of activity is slowing down. So we read these by time, and this is activity that's going on in the cortical areas. And as you can see, as you start to rest, it fluctuates a lot less. So when you start to sleep, you see this sort of activity, the theta frequencies, and then in deep sleep, what we see is very slow wave. We even call this slow wave sleep. These waves are really slow and really big. These are delta frequencies. Now, um, you can see this is also data from an EEG that I pulled off the internet, and you can see awake frequencies and moving through the stages of sleep. There are 4 stages of sleep. We call it 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, actually, 5 stages of sleep, with the last stage being REM sleep. And what you see is you sort of see deeper and deeper, or slower and slower waveforms, larger waveforms that are slowing down. And then when you're in the deepest stage of sleep, this is sometimes referred to as the stage 4 slow wave sleep, or SWS. You might have read about that, slow wave sleep. And then you transition into a period called REM, or rapid eye movement. And this is the deepest sleep. But the issue, one of the funny things about this deepest state of sleep is that it's almost indistinguishable from awake EEG activity. So if we were to compare these top 2 figures, what we find is that they're nearly the same. This is the paradox of sleep. Okay, in other words, at the deepest stage of sleep, REM sleep, REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, the EEG activity looks like you're awake. So if you see an EEG, um, you might not know what stage of sleep or what stage of arousal a person is in. You need more information. You need REM movements, random rapid eye movement measurements, or you need breathing measurements or something else. It looks as if your brain is just as awake during the deepest stage of sleep than it is when it's awake. And that's the paradox of sleep. So, why is it that we sleep? And why is it that we have even REM sleep? And this is a puzzling question, and a question that we still don't know an answer to. There are competing theories and hypotheses. Um, the three that your book mentions are one, the sort of rest hypothesis, and that is that this intuitive hypothesis that we sleep to rest. You know that we're tired after a long day, and this is downtime. Okay. Um, while that sounds intuitive, like everybody knows that you sleep when you're sleepy, it turns out that if the rest hypothesis were true, then a simple thought experiment might be in order, and that is lay down for 8 hours, but don't sleep, and get up and tell me if you feel rested or not. And most of us don't. Most of us feel horrible and groggy. We need sleep for some other reason than just resting our body and our muscles and so on. Another idea is that it conserves energy at times of the day when aren't a lot of food items to find or predators are um, out, then we need to conserve energy at certain times of the day, and that's what sleep is for. This is a possible explanation that we don't have a whole lot of uh, strong data for. Other people say that it's a restorative period or time. That this is the time when the body rebuilds things and remakes supplies for the day. But the question is, we don't know what all those things are. There's still questions about what it actually restores. A current theory is that look, this is important for learning and memory, and that's been where research is focused on the last decade or decade and a half or so. And neuroplasticity is implicated here, and we have a lot of data showing that, for example, if I teach you something and then give you a good night's sleep, you'll perform better on a test than if I teach you something and then 12 hours, 8 hours later give you a test without sleep. It seems that sleep helps us organize what we have done during the day, and the brain activity is sort of a way of our day replaying and being reorganized and reconsolidated. A current theory of sleep that has a lot of support for it. Evolution is sleep. All animals, it appears, sleep, and there's so many interesting things about sleep in the animal kingdom. It turns out that almost all mammals that we've studied, and all birds that we've studied, require REM sleep. If you don't, if these animals are deprived of REM sleep, they actually get sick and die. So sleep deprivation is trouble. I mean, we've all had that sort of experience, but REM sleep is particularly problematic. And yeah, there's a lot of fascinating things about sleep and sleep studies. So let me tell you how we one of the ways that we study sleep in the laboratory with rodents at least. These are rats, and they are on a device that has been called disc over water. And what is happening here is this is a disc and this is like a tub of water. Now they can smell each other, but they can't touch each other because there's a wall in here. But what happens is the disc goes around, and these guys are usually one of these guys is wired to um, an EEG. Believe it or not, you can put an EEG in a rat and detect sleep, and particularly in um, sleep deprivation studies or selective deprivation studies, we use REM. And what happens is if we detect that the animal's starting to sleep, this disc starts to move around. And what happens is if he falls asleep, he bumps up against this wall, but the disc pushes him off into the water until he wakes up and has to climb back on the disc. Um, Rats don't generally like water, so this keeps them awake. The reason that we have another animal on the other side, we call this a yoked control, and that is that he experiences everything this guy experiences, but he's not deprived of REM sleep. What controls the motor driving is the guy that we want to deprive of REM sleep. So this is sometimes called disc over water. Here's sort of what it looks like in a cartoon format. Is they can eat and drink all they want, but there's a pool of water underneath them, and if they fall asleep, the disc starts moving, functionally pushing them into the water. They have to get back out of the water and climb back on. Now, in the early studies with this procedure and with this apparatus, many of the rats that were deprived of REM sleep wound up dying. They wind up getting very sick and dying. There were a lot of hypotheses about why this was the case. Was it actually REM sleep or was it something else? They ate a lot of food, so it wasn't a starvation. They were well hydrated, but the one thing that hasn't been ruled out was whether they got some sort of sickness or respiratory infections or problems from continually falling in the water. But it was at least some evidence to suggest that REM sleep is critical to life. So that ends my little video on sleep. Talk to you soon.